From WBRN Radio in Boston and on the Boston Red Network in the USA. This is a BR on the World, our international affairs program, our international program, news program, political program, economic program, all-in-one program. The title of this episode, President Mugabe, Soldiers On. President Mugabe addressed the nation today. You will hear that, and you will also hear an analysis by some commentators within Zimbabwe from the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Service. Now, what happened today was the president gave about a 20-minute address to the people of Zimbabwe, saying that he will remain in office until the Party Congress of zanu-pf party, and at that time they will take care of the parliamentary business, have a debate about where the party will go. He recognized shortcomings in his leadership and also problems with other people in the zanu-pf party. It is a political party, and it is based upon the Constitution that in 1980, after the liberation of Zimbabwe from the neo-colonialists, the racists, the Rhodesian nation. And one important thing to remember here, we have this Emerson in Zimbabwe. Have to look at his name to pronounce it. We are getting his name, and if you quickly pronounce it, it's better to do. But anyway, Mr. Emerson Sellout Mugabe is or had been the vice president. He's nicknamed the Crocodile. He was a security chief, and now the debate is what type of government will be in the future for the people of Zimbabwe. Now, the commentators talk about one model would be the Chinese model, and that if you tune in to the program, it is part of our efforts here, BR on the World, of the Chinese Communist Party. That we covered it. It's on the Boston Red Network, so you can find it on many of these outlets. On Spreaker, it is there for you to listen to President Xi and his address to the 19th Party Conference, where he lays out what the party planned to do till 2034, 2035. As President Mugabe said, special attention has to be to the economy and shortcomings in the economy and in development, particularly in development. Those are some of the things that have not moved forward. And one of the commentator brought up the interests of some of these people, particularly in the mining sector. Now, you realize, as in U.S. politics, there are people that have interests in different sectors. Now, what you do not have in Zimbabwe is the quote-unquote lobbyist types that you have in the U.S., but you do have factions within the party, in the military, that have interest in the mining sector. In other words, this is all about the economics of the nation and where it will go. And many of the people that came out to demonstrate would have, as one commentator said, came out to demonstrate in favor of a dog's bone if that would have been offered up. This is one of the things you look at very, very closely in many nations when you have sudden change. We saw that happen in Ceausescu in Romania. The administration, his regime fell. But the point is not how the regime falls, it's what it will be replaced by. The same thing happened in the former Soviet Union when they ushered in the Yeltsin government's so-called a freely elected government. What was it about? Well, it was about robbing the former the Soviet Union of its state enterprises, ended in a depression, a very, very bad situation. And now they have made a comeback as the Russian Federation, but it is much less the size of the old Soviet Union. And also at the same time, they went more backward into a Russian nationalism, which does not work, period. And these are some of the problems that happened. The same thing happened in the GDR. The GDR collapsed. The government there collapsed. They unified with the Federal Republic, and now it's one Germany. But the problem is poverty is still in the former East. And now people in the former East have resorted to a German nationalism, similar to what happened on the Schicklgruber by Adolf Hitler. Now, these are the types of developments are not good for the humanity or for the nation at best. Now, what has plagued many countries on the continent, and one of the problems we have in the West is people refer well to Africa. There are many nations within on the African continent, roughly 120, some very small nations you have not heard of, but at the same time, they're not homogeneous. Period. They have different routes of development. And when you start talking about these international organizations like the World Bank, which represents the developed world's interests, and the International Monetary Fund, which sits in D.C. Now, what this is, these so-called funds, they're an outcome of Wilsonian foreign policy, named after the racist President Woodrow Wilson. And they cannot be but organizations that represent the colonial past. And to the International Monetary Fund, many of the prescriptions that they had for nations did not work. They've admitted to this so-called capitalist model. So don't be fooled by that. And many of the NGOs, non-governmental agencies, particularly development agencies, they are running from the same cookie cutter. What they are doing is presenting to these countries a failed capitalist model that they have to follow, and unfortunately it does not work. And when it does not work, they lend this money to these nations, and the nations strapped with debt. As the citizens of the U.S. are now, some $20 trillion or more of debt. And this is a situation that they cannot pay back the debt. Even with, say, 20% debt forgiveness, that's another palace trick. But they're still stuck with the other 80% or 70% or 60% that they must pay back with money they do not have. Because the funds that were allocated to them in such a way that it did not benefit the nation. It only benefited the capitalist class that had investments in the nation primarily. And others went to outright turn the other head, corruption. And they knew about this. So as nations move to stamp out so-called corruption and go to transparency, there's always a problem. And I'm assuming this is the reason that they're thinking of moving to more of a Chinese model. Now, if this Emerson Mnangagwa decided that if they elected him to be leader of the party, I don't know if that will stand or not, because zanu-pf may have that, but they have opposition forces that are more in tune to sell out the country and the people of Zimbabwe. So, in other words, what you have is you have all of these hyenas, like a circus ring, have all assembled there in the nation to cut up the pie amongst them. This is all what this is about. And try to, as they say, move deals forward. And the people would be best served. It would behest the people of Zimbabwe to watch what is going on and not get into an emotional frenzy, as what happened in other countries there's this euphoria. And then all of a sudden, these new forces set in. Same thing happened in Ukraine. And there's very little progress made. And who facilitated these activities? Well, you have obviously other nations, and in terms of Zimbabwe, you have the British intelligence services there working overtime, according to documents discovered by the Reuters news organization, that this plot had been with Emerson Mnangagwa for over a year. And then it was choreographed. What was interesting today is President Mugabe was addressing live using his papers there, and the generals, the same generals that put forth this so-called coup, not sure what we'll term it as, quasi, a pseudo-coup, whatever you want to call it, were assembled there. Now, who was pulling their strings, who knows, but they had the air marshal there, they had the same generals, the chief of staff, the army, etc., were all shaking hands with President Mugabe and sitting there watching President Mugabe address the nation live. And you got to remember, now this man is 93 years old, and he can sit and read a statement live. DJ Trump can't do that. Of course, DJ Trump is 70 years old. Most are using, say, teleprompters, but they're doing it what we call in the U.S. old school technique of using the papers. Bernie Sanders does the same thing. He uses his papers, or from his legal pad, that he does his speeches, whereas our national leader, Dr. Al Sharpton, does his, being a minister, does his from a memory, basically speaking, sometime a little outline there on the issue that he does. But it's interesting to watch President Mugabe making his speech and what he is actually talking about in terms of the party and how party structure is properly run. If you notice in the speech, which you will hear now, and also the reflection coming after our little commentary here, that he's talking about the future of the party. He realizes he's 93 years old. He'll not be there always. And he also knows that the pros and cons, in other words, that is looking at the situation dialectically. He used pros and cons because there are pros, there are cons, there are two things working here, positives, negatives in this whole scenario. Yes, the party did stray, but the party, as he said, since 1980, has a history. And that history marches on. And if the party will be a party, it will march on past the present leaders and the future leaders of Zimbabwe. And they need to follow more of a model like that, where they put together a 5-year plan. We were looking at some of their official statistics that are coming out. I think inflation was at about 2.4% or wherever it was. And remember, when they had their crises, they started pegging things to the U.S. dollar, which did some things. But the whole economic crisis is not something President Mugabe created. What happened there was the colonial country, Britain and others, interfering in the domestic affairs of Zimbabwe by not buying their products and various other things, economic boycotts. Those are the kinds of things, in other words, that's economic violence. Let not you be fooled about these so-called sanctions, they call them, boycott sanctions. But these are state actors, stakeholders, not individuals banding together as we did with apartheid South Africa in the disinvestment movement and the boycotts of South Africa, and now, of course, the boycotts by many scholars, entertainers, etc., of the Zionist regime setting in Tel Aviv, Israel. So these are the kinds of things that occur, and this is what has caused problems with the economy. President Mugabe went ahead with land redistribution, where European farmers that got the land illegally in the first place were disbanded, and they split these farms into smaller farms, larger farms into smaller farms. Now you'll hear this thing, well, many of the people, the war veterans that got to farm, didn't know how to farm. Well, there were farmers or peasants there that knew how to farm. They worked on the farms. Whereas in the Soviet Union, in China, and in the U.S., you have very, very large farms. Whether these farms are state-owned or privately owned, thousands of hectares are devoted to certain kinds of farms, say crops and etc. In the U.S., you have situations where you have fairly large farms that are farmed by farmers, but they're actually owned by some very large corporation, and the process is there. So that can work. That is not something that cannot work. There are so many hectares, or acres as we call them, that you need to have to be productive in a situation. And farmers here in the U.S. have become more productive because of presses. Now, we have another situation that we've confronted in this country is these so-called generic foods, which have been banned in China, and they're generically engineered. You see that stamp on foods, and when I see it, I avoid them. That is a problem. We've been growing natural foods around here forever. But now you have those, the bees are carrying it, in other words, have a mess. And they'd like to get this into countries like Zimbabwe, which we're looking at the tobacco leaves. They can produce crops there, and they have minerals there. The problem is getting the proceeds from these minerals to the national treasure and not to individuals. And this is a big problem. You got to remember, just because you got whatever kind of mine you got, you have to get the materials out of the ground and ship them to the EU or wherever you're shipping them to, and that is where the prices are set. They're set as commodities, and most of those commodity markets are controlled either in Europe or in the U.S. or wherever. So that is part of your situation. Nonetheless, President Robert Mugabe, president of the nation, speaking to Zimbabwe, speaking to the people of Zimbabwe and to people of the world. Now, there was a short, before we leave, there was a very short, I don't know, less than a minute or so, on the BBC. But to get the full address, we decided to carry the full address because not very many outlets in the West are actually carrying the full address. Because we normally in the West do not deal with international affairs unless it is certain selective nations. It used to be, say, Afghanistan and Iraq, or Iraq, excuse me. But they have sort of fallen, as they say, off the screen. So we get a little bit about the Democratic Republic of Korea and Smart Cookie, Missile Man. Now I guess he's Little Missile Man. You get that for your international news here for about a minute, and then you move on to something else. And that is where you find yourself in the U.S. So what we're trying to do at WBRN Radio here and on the Boston Red Network is go to local events, whether it be in Birmingham, Alabama, Montgomery, with the various machinations of Judge Roy Moore, our current polling, the election that just ended in New Orleans, Louisiana. Incidentally, tonight on our Boston Red program, we'll be talking about the election down in New Orleans. The first time in 300 years, the city of New Orleans will have next year a woman mayor. So we'll look at that particular situation there, and we'll also look at the tax plan, where it is, what will be done about it, and the latest polling out of Alabama, because a seat is at stake there. Nonetheless, have a good evening, and we'll talk to you on the Monday Morning Quarterback on the Boston Red part of the network, where we talk about that and also about sport. We'll try to get some Zimbabwean sport in also. Good day.
Fellow Zimbabweans, I address you tonight on the back of a meeting I held today with the nation's Security Forces Command element. This meeting, which was facilitated by a mediating team led by Father Mukonori S.J. of the Catholic Church, followed an operation mounted by the Zimbabwe Defense Forces in the week that has gone by, and which was triggered by concerns arising from their reading of the state of affairs in our country and in the ruling zanu-pf party. Whatever the pros and cons of the way they went about registering those concerns, I, as the President of Zimbabwe and as their Commander-in-Chief, do acknowledge the issues they have drawn my attention to, and do believe that these were raised in the spirit of honesty and out of deep and patriotic concern for the stability of our nation and for the welfare of our people. As I address you, I'm also aware of a whole range of concerns which has come from you all as citizens of our great country, and who thus deserve our untrammeled attention. Today's meeting with the command element has underscored the need for us to collectively start processes that return our nation to normalcy, so all our people can go about their business unhindered in an environment of perfect peace and security, assured that law and order obtain and prevail as before, and endure well into the future. If there is any one observation we have made and drawn from events of the past week, it is the unshakable pedestal upon which rests our state of peace, law and order, amply indicating that as Zimbabweans, we are generally a peaceably disposed people, and with a givenness to expressing our grievances and to resolving our differences by ourselves, and with a level of dignity, discipline, and restraint so rare to many other nations. This is to be admired. Indeed, such traits must form the pith of our national character and personality. Yes, a veritable resource we summon and draw upon in times of vicissitudes. The operation I have alluded to did not amount to a threat to our well-cherished constitutional order, nor was it a challenge to my authority as head of state and government. Not even as Commander-in-Chief of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces. To the man, the command element remained respectful and comported with the dictates and mores of constitutionalism. True, a few incidents may have occurred here and there, but these are being corrected. I'm happy that throughout the short period pillars of state remained functional. Even happier for me, and arising from today's meeting is a strong sense of collegiality and comradeship, now binding the various arms of our security establishment. This should redound to greater peace and offer an abiding sense of security in communities and in our entire nation. Among the issues discussed is that relating to our economy, which, as we all know, is going through a difficult patch. Our great concern to that guide the operations of all its organs. Of greater concern, may I read this again? I beg your pardon. Of greater concern to our commanders are the well-founded fears that the lack of unity and commonness of purpose in both party and government was translating into perceptions of inattentiveness to the economy. Open public spurs between high-ranking officials in the party and government, exacerbated by multiple conflicting messages from both the party and government, made the criticisms leveled against us inescapable. Amidst of all this, flagship projects already adopted by government stood stalled or mired in needless controversies. All this now has to stop as we inaugurate a new work culture and pace which will show a strong sense of purpose and commitment to turning around our economy in terms of our policies. Zimbabwe government remains committed to improving the social and material conditions of the people. Government will soon unveil an entrepreneurial skills and business development program which will empower and unleash gainful projects at our growth points and rural areas. Fellow Zimbabweans, we are a nation born out of a protracted struggle for national independence. Our roots lie in that epochal struggle whose goals and ideals must guide our present and structure our future. The tradition of resistance is our collective legacy, whose core tenets must be subscribed by all across generations and across times. Indeed, this too was a great concern for our commanders, who themselves were makers of that revolution, and often at very tender ages and at great personal peril. We still have in our various communities veterans of that founding struggle, who might have found the prevailing management of national and party issues quite alienating. This must be corrected without delay, including ensuring that these veterans continue to play central roles in the lives of our nation. We must all recognize that their participation in the war of liberation exacted lifelong costs, which, whilst hardly repayable, may still be assuaged and ameliorated. In respect of the party, and the party issues raised both by the commanders and by the general membership of zanu-pf, there too stand acknowledged. These two stand acknowledged. They have to be attended to with a great sense of urgency. However, I am aware that as a party of liberation, zanu-pf has over the years written elaborate rules and procedures that guide the operations of all its organs and the personnel. Indeed, the current criticism raised against the command element, but raised against it by the command element and some of its members have arisen from a well-founded perception that the party was stretching or even failing in its own rules and procedures. The way forward, thus, cannot be based on swapping, vying cliques that ride roughshod over party rules and procedures. There has to be a net return to the guiding principles of our party as enshrined in its constitution, which must apply fairly and equitably in all situations and before all members. The era of victimization and arbitrary decisions must be put behind, so as we all embrace a new ethos predicated on the supreme law of our party and nourished by an abiding sense of camaraderie. To all this must be a general recognition that zanu-pf is a party of traditions and has been served by successive generations who are bound together by shared ideals and values, which must continue to reign supreme in our nation. Hints of intergeneration conflict must be resolved through a harmonized melding of old established players as they embrace and welcome new ones through a well-defined sense of hierarchy and succession. Indeed, all these matters will be discussed and settled at the forthcoming Congress within the framework of a clear roadmap that seeks to resolve once and for all any omissions or contradictions that have affected our party negatively. The Congress is due in a few weeks from now. I will preside over its processes, which must not be prepossessed by any acts calculated to undermine it or to compromise the outcomes in the eyes of the public. As I conclude this address, I am aware that many developments have occurred in the party or have been championed and done by individuals in the name of the party. Given the failings of the past and the anger these might have triggered in some quarters, such developments are quite understandable. However, we cannot be guided by bitterness or vengefulness, both of which would not make us any better party members or any better Zimbabweans. Our hallowed policy of reconciliation, which we pronounced in 1980, and through which we reached out to those who had occupied and oppressed us for nearly a century, and those who had traded fire with in a bitter war, surely cannot be unavailable to our own, both in the parties and in our nation. We must learn to forgive and resolve contradictions, real or perceived, in a comradely Zimbabwean spirit. I am confident that from tonight our whole nation at all levels gets refocused as we put shoulder to the wheel amidst the promising agricultural season of rain upon us. Let us all move forward, reminding ourselves of our wartime mantra. Iweni tinebasa. I thank you and good night. Sorry, on the two places. I hope you can correct. It's a long speech. Katenda. Asante sana.
Is it shock? Tabiso will get more details on that as we speak to political economist and analyst Tamuka Chirimamboa, who is live in studio with us. Now, where did it go wrong with President Mugabe? We've just seen our foreign editor, Sophie Mkwena, just painting a picture for us and seeing the background where she mentioned the fact that a lot is to come with regards to decisions that were made in terms of a parliamentary process that will be implemented. As we watch the live broadcast or the live speech from President Mugabe, A lot of expectation was that he would resign. What went wrong?
Yeah, I think firstly what we have to look at is just how the murky and more murkier the transition terrain is becoming in Zimbabwe. First of all, if you look at the strategy which the military had deployed, and also the faction aligned to former Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa, was to try and portray to the world that what they are staging is not a coup, which was a brilliant move. But also it seems as if, there's been some form of prevarications, particularly after Zimbabweans went into the streets. If actually you look at the address which happened, the masses, you found out that in particular Patrick Shinamasa was booed by people, and him even questioned what it meant. So there could be issues of doubts, but I feel there could have been a moment which could have been lost. But the question of saying, is President Mugabe gone or not? I think it has become more of a moot argument. President Mugabe is gone, but the question is now saying when. I think what he's trying to do is to try and buy more time in office and win more concessions for himself and as well as his allies around him, and also try to come out like manage his reputation that has been damaged or bruised. It's much more about him trying to appear as if he has not been defeated. So it's a bit tricky, but I think it seems to be playing out to be a bit more uncertain. But the thing is that President Mugabe is going to go at the end of the day.
In terms of that, President Mugabe going, why do you think it's taken him so long and to get to such a point where he has to literally be pushed out by members of his own party?
What we have to understand is that President Mugabe, why he managed to get to this level. President Mugabe has always harbored the Life Presidents project, also the one-party state, which actually collapsed in 1989 when he was defeated. But then what has happened is that President Mugabe has been managing to playing faction after faction within ZANU-PF. So even when you look at the revolt, that's which was pitting former Vice President Joyce Mjuru and former Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa, it didn't start. Even before that, there were people like Edison Zobo as well, who were also like the kingpin of the faction of this. But this has been playing on. This has been playing on and on until it got to a head point where it could no longer proceed. But what has happened is that in the end, those who were in zanu-pf realized, in particular after the axing of Vice President Mnangagwa and also the axing of close to 400 officials within the ruling party in the other structures, and the attempts to elevate the First Lady to the VP post and potentially the presidents, it actually clearly showed to people that they were all going to be decimated by President Mugabe if they don't unite. So hence why they had to all turn against him.
Let's speak about the process going forward. We saw our foreign editor, Sophie Mgweno, speaking about the parliamentary process. Take us through that process.
Yeah, basically the parliamentary process, the one which is actually being touted, is Section 97, because there are actually two sections within the Constitution. Section 97, which deals with the issues of removal of the Vice President or the President, and usually this go via impeachment. And listening to the talk, to some of the people who are within the Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa's faction, the general talk amongst them is using the section which deals with issues of physical or mental incapacity. So this is what they want to use, which after where they have to give 7 days notice, and already Parliament, the Speaker of Parliament called for Parliament to reconvene on Tuesday, which will be the 21st. So if they are going to go through that, which means they give a motion and a notice of the motion, and which means that once that motion is given, it's supposed to be debated after 7 days, and then after the lapse of 7 days, the motion is to be debated within 21 days, which means if the kind of agreement that was showing it was there before all this process started is still there, it might mean then that maybe they can agree to say they have it debated within a day or two, and then they move on to appoint the committee that is to investigate. But otherwise, the other section, which is like 109, which deals with vote of no confidence, I don't see that, because that one automatically triggers an election. And it means even those who are currently in place would lose out. So I don't see people wanting to go to an election.
There's been a lot of talk about whether the removal of President Mugabe would bring change to Zimbabwe. What's your take on this?
I think one thing which we have to notice is that the removal of President Mugabe potentially may bring change. But then the question is, what kind of change will come to Zimbabwe?
To what extent?
You see. So basically, if I look at the faction which seems to have prevailed, which looks like it's going to likely to win at the end of the day, Vice President Mnangagwa's faction, basically I think what they want to try and do is to try and regenerate ZANU-PF. But when they regenerate ZANU-PF, what you're most likely going to get, they're trying to follow the CPC, that is the Chinese People's Communist Party model, or maybe what Chama Pinduzi did in Tanzania. But then the nature of government that will emerge, it will be much more of a very strong and kind of autocratic government like what you have in your Rwanda or Ethiopia, with a booming economy possibly, but then with a very limited civil liberties and democratic deficit.
Now, let's just cross to Thabiso, who is standing by. Thabiso, your take on this?
Thank you very much there, Lulu. Well, just before we get back to that, just news coming now, Simpiwe, the breaking news that Zimbabwean veterans have just announced that they will impeach President Robert Mugabe.
Now, the 93-year-old has not resigned as expected during his address to the nation earlier. Now, the veteran leader faces the apparent end of his 37-year rule. And he was sacked earlier, remember, as ZANU-PF leader. And the party gave him until noon tomorrow to step down as president of the country or face impeachment. And I think this gives credence to the breaking news that we've
it seems like, as you said, the story keeps on rolling over and over. Again, now listen to the conversation that Lulu is currently having there with the analyst. Obviously, we wake up tomorrow morning, things might have changed totally as far as what we've learned tonight.
But I don't think with Robert Mugabe is a very defiant person. He's a fighter. He's a very strong-willed person, with a very strong character, and he doesn't go down without a fight.
Well, let's go back to the analyst, maybe Lulu, you and your analyst. What do you make of that? The veterans now saying that they want to impeach Robert Mugabe regardless of the process, as your analyst is currently trying to describe, will take place next week.
Now, Tamuka, we've just heard this breaking news, and now what's your take on this? Because now we've just been speaking about the process that is to follow, and now they've come out and made an announcement that this is going to happen.
Yes, certainly there's a very high likelihood that he will be impeached, and the impeachment can be very successful. But at the end of the day, I think it will boil down to what those who have proved to be victorious in ZANU-PF are going to do, because basically there's the issue to say ZANU-PF, before even this started, already had a 2/3 majority in parliament, and in terms of the required numbers, they have it. And I think even after the Central Committee, Patrick Chinamasa actually made it quite clear that they do have the number. It's a ZANU-PF affair. But there's also the fact that this the opposition has hindered earlier on, and as of now they haven't yet shown any change in terms of the direction that they would not support the impeachment of President Mugabe. So I think that route will go on, and President Mugabe is most likely going to be impeached. But then the question which we will have to look at is, once he's impeached, then it means the process may try to drag a bit longer than we expected.
Now, when you say the process may drag a bit longer than expected, and seeing my colleague there, Simpiwe, mentioning the fact that Mugabe is a fighter. I mean, today everyone expected that he would resign after this, the meeting that he had with the chiefs and ZANU-PF and the commanders. The expectation was he was going to resign. But watching him and going through his speech and also missing some pages where he eventually spoke about camaraderie and where he comes from, with a lot of people who are now seemingly turning against him. He spoke of unity and developments going forward. What does this mean? The impeachment, how long will that process take?
I think the process will actually, how long it will take will depend in particular whether those in zanu-pf, in particular Vice President Emerson Mnangagwa's allies, are going to be magnanimous. But if they are going to go by what Patrick Chinamasa has said earlier on after the Central Committee, that it's a zanu-pf business, and become a bit arrogant, then it means that this process might begin to drag a bit longer. Because one thing which we have to look at, that even the background, even in Zimbabwe already, the euphoria that had gathered even after that massive demonstration was beginning to peel away. So there is need to make sure that this is something which is across the political divide. But I think that one will see as things unfold. But as it is for President Mugabe, it's also about him feeling betrayed. Because one thing which we have to remember, the people who have removed President Mugabe, it's not because it's because about the people, it's simply because about their interests. Because one thing which you have to take into account is how the military, or those who are linked to the military, had actually become an economic class on its own, with strong interest in mining. I mean, they're involved in mining, they're involved in all sorts of kind of business. So basically, this they just want someone who can protect their interests, and this is what this whole fight is about. It's all about zanu-pf and not the people. But then the question is, to what extent will they be able to hold or to keep that galvanized force which we had seen brewing yesterday, to say, will it going to be a bubble that will burst soon? But that can be told by time.
And now, just speaking of the powers that they have and the economic interests that they have, is Emerson Mnangagwa a part of this?
Certainly he is part of this, because one thing which we have to look at, you have to look at what Patrick Chinamasa has been trying to do before he was dismissed as finance minister. That is the Lima process, the re-engagement process with the West. And we also have to look at the interview which Vice President Mnangagwa gave in the New African, and also the address where he addressed in China, where he was actually, that should be a year ago, where he was talking about Zimbabwe having gone like 20 years back. And the indications which he has seen in beginning to make concessions to business, which became one of the things which was being accused that he's betraying, he's moving away from the discourse of Thedi Chumrenga, indigenization. And this is the faction that has promised that even when it gets into power, it's going to reverse all things like indigenization and the land reform. And there are telltale signs to this.
Now, should the people of Zimbabwe be excited about these changes that are taking place? We saw the demonstrations yesterday in the streets of Zimbabwe, all over the country, where people were excited and they came out and spoke out loudly, whereas before they weren't as they wouldn't show the emotion. So this time around, we saw people screaming the fact that Mugabe must go.
Yeah, certainly what you have to understand that the zanu-pf rule had been personified around the picture of President Mugabe. It had become like a cult, become the symbol of zanu-pf and its bad governance practices. But also, in as much as that has got a semblance of truth, it's a very limited perception to think that the problems of Zimbabwe is solely President Mugabe's problems, but it was because of him and his ruler. But then you have to understand the excitement of the people, that these are people who have been oppressed, and for them, even if you were going to have a baboon or a dog being presented as an alternative to President Mugabe, people would be happy. They say any change that comes better, and they will deal with it at a later stage, whatever problems might arise. This was the thinking with the people on the ground, but whether that will come out is another story.
Now, Tabuka, let's go back to the issue of the impeachment process. What are we likely to see in terms of if the opposition comes together and works with the ruling governing party? That process, what is going to happen from day one up until the end? And as Mugabe is a fighter, what does this mean in terms of him and, exiting and just walking away? What does he get from this?
I think what we have to look at is the opposition, if it gangs up with those in the ruling party, it will actually reduce the time of possible debate within Parliament. And it will also expedite, and I think it will also try and break down the will of President Mugabe. In as much as he's a fighter, he will fight because President Mugabe, he actually realized that the point which he has reached is a point of no return. So for him, it's better to die in battle than to surrender.
What does this mean for the family? Where is Mrs. Mugabe? The children, what's happening exactly? Because this is now obviously affecting the family. We saw his nephew, one of the ministers, I think the service minister yesterday, yes, speaking from a secret location and saying that Mugabe is not going to step down and he's going to die fighting.
Yeah, basically what it means for the Mugabe family, it means tough times and very turbulent times ahead, because they've never endeared themselves with the people. If you look at the children, I mean, with the ruckus that they've been causing, even the nephew Patrick Joao, I mean, who was being interviewed, the arrogance which he has always exhibited. You even look that even his son-in-law had actually resigned before this thing happened, a few days before, and he's already in Malaysia.
Tamuka, we are going to continue this discussion as the developments continue happening in Zimbabwe, but I will cross over to my colleagues Tabiso and Simpiwe to give us the headlines.
Indeed there, Lulu. Well, it's just gone 1 minute past 10 o'clock Central African time, 22:01 actually Central African time, and obviously we're going to take quick headline news, and the lead story obviously being the fact that the President of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, has yet to pronounce his resignation from the seat of power. So let's take those news headlines right